The desert sun blazed mercilessly over the rugged mountains of Afghanistan as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet. Inside the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt, the familiar weight of her flight gear felt reassuring as she prepared for what should have been a routine close air support mission. Below her, the landscape stretched endlessly in shades of brown and tan, dotted with rocky outcroppings that had witnessed countless battles throughout history. Sarah had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but today felt different. Intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity in the region, and the ground forces were requesting immediate air support for a special operations team that had been conducting reconnaissance deep in Taliban territory. The radio crackled to life as her squadron leader briefed the pilots on their objectives. Hawkeye Flight. We have a SEAL team designated Bravo 6 operating in grid coordinates 41 SMB 112345 67890, the voice announced through her headset. They're conducting surveillance on a high-value target compound and may need immediate extraction support if things go sideways. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and checked her aircraft's weapons systems. Her A-10 was loaded with a full complement of 30mm cannon rounds, Maverick missiles, and cluster bombs, enough firepower to level a city block if necessary. The Warthog, as pilots affectionately called the A-10, was specifically designed for close air support missions, built to take punishment and deliver devastating firepower to protect ground troops. As the formation of 4 A-10s approached the target area, Sarah noticed how quiet the radio had become. Usually, ground controllers maintained constant communication during active operations, but today the airwaves seemed eerily silent. She glanced at her GPS display and confirmed they were approaching the designated coordinates where Bravo 6 was supposed to be operating. Suddenly, her radio exploded with panicked voices. "Mayday, Mayday! This is Bravo 6 Actual. We are taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Request immediate close air support." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader whose unit had stumbled into what appeared to be a major Taliban stronghold. Sarah's heart rate spiked as she heard the desperation in Morrison's voice. Through her targeting pod, she could see muzzle flashes erupting from dozens of positions around a small valley where the SEAL team had taken cover behind some large boulders. The Taliban fighters had apparently been waiting for them, suggesting this might have been an elaborate trap designed to lure American Special Forces into a kill zone. Hawkeye 2-1, I have eyes on friendly forces taking fire from multiple enemy positions, Sarah reported to her flight leader, requesting permission to engage immediately. But as she spoke, she realized the situation was far more complex than a simple close air support mission. The SEALs were completely surrounded, outnumbered by at least 10-1 and running low on ammunition. The radio chatter revealed the true scope of the crisis. What had started as a routine reconnaissance mission had turned into a nightmare scenario that would test every ounce of Sarah's training, courage, and determination. The lives of 124 elite warriors now hung in the balance, and she was about to make decisions that would either save them all or result in one of the most devastating losses in special operations history. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison pressed his back against the jagged rock formation, feeling the sharp edges cut through his tactical vest as bullets whistled overhead. His radio crackled with reports from his team members scattered throughout the rocky valley, each voice carrying the same message of desperation and dwindling hope. What had begun as a simple surveillance operation had transformed into a death trap that seemed impossible to escape. "Alpha Team report," Morrison shouted into his headset, trying to maintain control over the chaos unfolding around him. The response came in fragments as his men fought for their lives from behind whatever cover they could find. Petty Officer Rodriguez was pinned down near the eastern ridge with 3 other SEALs, while Chief Petty Officer Williams had taken position with his squad behind a cluster of boulders on the western side of the valley. The intelligence had been completely wrong. Instead of a small Taliban outpost, they had stumbled into what appeared to be a major staging area for insurgent operations. Hundreds of enemy fighters had emerged from hidden positions carved into the mountainside, their weapons ranging from ancient AK-47s to modern rocket-propelled grenades that sent deadly shrapnel flying in all directions. Morrison quickly assessed their situation through his binoculars, counting at least 200 muzzle flashes coming from elevated positions that provided the Taliban with perfect fields of fire. His team of 124 SEALs, originally deployed as multiple smaller units for the reconnaissance mission, had converged in this valley when the ambush began. Now they were trapped in a natural amphitheater with enemy fighters controlling all the high ground. "Sir, we've got wounded," came the urgent call from Petty Officer Thompson, whose voice carried the strain of someone trying to provide medical aid while under intense fire. Martinez took shrapnel to the leg, and Johnson's got a through-and-through in his shoulder. "We need immediate evacuation." Morrison felt the weight of command pressing down on him like the desert heat. Every decision he made in the next few minutes would determine whether his men lived or died. The Taliban fighters were methodically advancing down the slopes, using coordinated fire and movement tactics that suggested they had planned this ambush carefully. Someone had leaked their mission details or their communications had been compromised. The SEAL commander reached for his radio and contacted the nearest forward operating base. "Black Hawk Base, this is Bravo 6 Actual. We have 124 personnel surrounded and taking heavy casualties. We need immediate close air support and emergency extraction. Our position is Grid 41S MB 12345-67890. But be advised, this entire valley is hot with enemy activity." As Morrison spoke, a rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the rocks just 20 meters from his position, showering him with debris and temporarily deafening him. When his hearing returned, he could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance, but he knew that any rescue attempt would be suicide unless they could suppress the enemy fire from those elevated positions. The Taliban fighters had learned from previous encounters with American Special Forces. They had positioned heavy machine guns at key choke points, making it impossible for helicopters to approach safely. Anti-aircraft weapons were hidden among the rocks, waiting to shoot down any aircraft that came within range. The enemy had turned this remote valley into a carefully constructed killing field. Morrison realized that their only hope lay with the A-10 pilots circling overhead. The Warthogs were the only aircraft capable of providing the sustained, accurate firepower needed to break the Taliban's stranglehold on the high ground. But even that would require a pilot willing to fly dangerously low through intense anti-aircraft fire, risking everything to save a ground force that was running out of time and ammunition with each passing minute. Captain Sarah Mitchell circled high above the valley, her knuckles white as she gripped the flight controls and listened to the increasingly desperate radio calls from the trapped SEALs below. Through her targeting system, she could see the muzzle flashes erupting from dozens of positions along the ridgelines, creating a deadly crossfire that had pinned down the Special Operations Forces in the valley floor. "Hawkeye Flight. This is Overlord," came the voice of the mission commander back at headquarters. "You are ordered to maintain minimum safe altitude of 8,000 feet due to confirmed surface-to-air missile threats in the area. Repeat, do not descend below 8,000 feet under any circumstances." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she processed the order. From 8,000 feet, her weapons would be virtually useless for close air support. The 30mm cannon that made the A-10 so effective required much lower altitudes to achieve the precision needed to engage enemy positions without risking friendly fire. At that altitude, she might as well be throwing rocks at the Taliban fighters. "Overlord, this is Hawkeye 2-1, she responded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the frustration building inside her. "Request permission to descend to effective engagement altitude. The ground forces are taking heavy casualties and need immediate close air support." The response came back immediately and with finality. "Negative, Hawkeye 2-1. Orders stand. Maintain 8,000 feet minimum altitude. We have intelligence indicating multiple SA-7 and SA-14 surface-to-air missile systems in the area. Loss of aircraft is unacceptable." Sarah looked down at the valley where she could see the SEALs' positions being slowly overrun by advancing Taliban fighters. Smoke from explosions drifted across the rocky terrain, and she could make out small figures moving between the boulders, some wearing the tan uniforms of American forces, others in the darker clothing of insurgents. The distance between the two sides was closing rapidly. Her flight leader's voice crackled through the radio. "Hawkeye Flight, we'll provide what support we can from altitude. Use your Mavericks on any large concentrations of enemy forces, but stay high and stay safe." Sarah knew that Maverick missiles, while powerful, were designed for larger targets like vehicles and buildings. They would be of limited use against individual fighters scattered among the rocks. and the danger of friendly fire would be enormous given how close the opposing forces had become. The SEALs needed the precision firepower of her 30mm cannon, but that required her to descend into the deadly envelope of the enemy's anti-aircraft weapons. As she monitored the radio traffic, Sarah heard Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice break through the static. Any aircraft, this is Bravo 6 actual. We have multiple wounded and are running low on ammunition. The enemy is advancing on our positions from 3 sides. We need close air support immediately or we won't last another 10 minutes. The desperation in Morrison's voice cut through Sarah like a knife. She thought about the 124 men trapped below. Elite warriors who had dedicated their lives to protecting their country, now facing death in a remote valley thousands of miles from home. She thought about their families, their children who might grow up without fathers because she had followed orders and stayed safe at altitude. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career and potentially end it. She switched her radio to a private channel and spoke to her wingman, Captain Mike Stevens, who had been flying alongside her for the past 18 months. "Stevens, I'm going low. Cover me and watch for surface-to-air missiles." "Sarah, you can't," Stevens replied immediately. "You heard the orders. They'll court-martial you for disobeying direct commands." Sarah looked down at the valley one more time, watching as another explosion erupted near the SEAL positions. She thought about all the training that had brought her to this moment, all the simulations and exercises designed to prepare pilots for exactly this type of situation. None of the textbooks had prepared her for the moment when following orders meant watching good men die. "Sometimes you have to choose between your career and your conscience," she said quietly into the radio. "I choose my conscience." Sarah pushed her A-10 into a steep dive, feeling the familiar sensation of G-forces pressing her back into her ejection seat as she descended toward the valley floor. Her altimeter unwound rapidly. 7,000 feet, 6,000 feet, 5,000 feet, each 1,000 feet, bringing her deeper into the range of the Taliban's surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns. The first indication that she had entered the danger zone came as bright streaks of tracer fire began rising toward her aircraft, like deadly fireworks. The Taliban fighters had spotted her descent and were throwing everything they had at the lone A-10 diving toward their positions. Sarah could see the muzzle flashes from hidden gun positions carved into the rocky mountainside, each one sending streams of bullets in her direction. "Hawkeye 2-1, you are taking fire." Stevens's voice crackled through her headset with obvious concern. "Multiple AAA positions engaging you from the ridgelines. Recommend you climb immediately." Sarah ignored the warning and continued her descent, now at 3,000 feet and closing fast on her first target. Through her targeting pod, she had identified a heavy machine gun position that was pouring fire down on the eastern group of SEALs. The gun was positioned behind a natural rock barrier that provided excellent protection from ground assault, but it was vulnerable to attack from above. At 2,000 feet, Sarah felt the first impacts as bullets struck her aircraft. The A-10 was designed to absorb punishment, with titanium armor protecting the cockpit and critical systems, but the sound of metal striking metal still sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. Warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel as minor systems took damage from the intense ground fire. "Sarah, your aircraft is hit," Stevens called out. "I can see smoke coming from your left engine." Sarah glanced at her engine instruments and saw that her left turbofan was indeed showing signs of damage, with slightly elevated temperatures and reduced power output. But the engine was still running and the A-10 was famous for its ability to fly home on one engine if necessary. She had come too far to turn back now. At 1,500 feet, Sarah lined up her first attack run and squeezed the trigger on her 30mm GAU-8 cannon. The massive 7-barrel rotary cannon erupted to life with its distinctive buzzing roar, sending 30mm depleted uranium rounds downrange at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The heavy machine gun position disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris as the high explosive rounds found their target. "Direct hit on the eastern ridge position," came Morrison's excited voice over the radio. "That's one gun down. We can move our wounded now." But Sarah's victory was short-lived. As she pulled up from her first attack run, a surface-to-air missile streaked up from a hidden position, its smoke trail clearly visible against the blue sky. Sarah threw her aircraft into a violent evasive maneuver, dispensing chaff and flares while pulling G-forces that pushed her to the edge of consciousness. The missile missed by mere meters, exploding behind her aircraft and sending shrapnel rattling against her tail section. More warning lights illuminated her cockpit as secondary systems failed, but the primary flight controls remained responsive. Sarah banked hard to the right and lined up for another attack run, this time targeting a mortar position that had been dropping rounds dangerously close to the SEAL command post. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Overlord. The mission commander's voice cut through the radio traffic with obvious anger. You are ordered to climb immediately and return to base. You are in direct violation of standing orders. Sarah switched off her command frequency and continued her attack run. She could see Taliban fighters running between positions, trying to reposition their weapons to engage her aircraft more effectively. Some of them were so close to the SEAL positions that she had to adjust her aim constantly to avoid hitting friendly forces. Her second attack run was even more dangerous than the first. Flying at barely 1,000 feet above the valley floor, Sarah was within range of small arms fire from every enemy position. Bullets were striking her aircraft continuously now, and she could feel the subtle changes in flight characteristics as various components sustained damage. But her cannon fire was devastatingly effective. Another heavy weapons position vanished under her barrage, and she could see Taliban fighters breaking cover and running for better positions. For the first time since the ambush began, the SEALs were getting some breathing room to reorganize their defenses and treat their wounded. Sarah's third attack run brought her directly over the center of the Taliban positions, flying so low that she could see individual fighters scrambling for cover among the rocks. Her A-10 had taken considerable damage by now. The left engine was running rough. Hydraulic fluid was streaming from several bullet holes, and her right aileron was responding sluggishly to control inputs. But the aircraft was still flying, still fighting. Through her headset, she could hear the change in Morrison's voice as the situation on the ground began to shift. Hawkeye 2-1, you're breaking their lines. The Eastern Group is repositioning to better cover. We've got eyes on Taliban fighters retreating from the northern ridge. Sarah lined up on a cluster of Taliban fighters who had taken position behind a large boulder formation. These men had been directing accurate rifle fire at the SEAL medics trying to treat wounded personnel, making it impossible for the Americans to provide proper medical care. Sarah's cannon fire turned their position into a crater, sending a clear message to other enemy fighters about the cost of targeting wounded men. But the Taliban weren't giving up without a fight. As Sarah pulled up from her attack run, she saw the telltale smoke trail of another surface-to-air missile launching from a concealed position. This time the missile was tracking perfectly, and her damaged aircraft couldn't maneuver as aggressively as before. Sarah dispensed her remaining chaff and flares while pulling into a desperate climbing turn. The missile detonated just behind her aircraft, close enough that the blast wave slammed her forward against her harness and filled the cockpit with acrid smoke. Warning alarms screamed as multiple systems failed simultaneously. Her left engine finally quit completely, trailing black smoke as it wound down to silence. Oil pressure dropped to zero on several critical systems, and her primary hydraulics failed with a loud bang that she could hear even over the noise of combat. Sarah, your bird is hurt bad, Stevens called out from above. You're streaming fluids, and I can see structural damage to your wing. You need to climb out and head for the tanker. Sarah checked her instruments and realized that Stevens was right. Her aircraft was dying around her. The control stick felt mushy and unresponsive, requiring constant pressure to maintain level flight. The smell of hydraulic fluid and electrical smoke filled the cockpit despite her oxygen mask. By all rights, she should climb to safety and nurse her crippled aircraft back to friendly territory. But as she looked down at the valley, Sarah could see that the battle was reaching its critical point. The Taliban fighters, recognizing that air support was breaking their ambush, were launching a coordinated assault on the SEAL positions. Dozens of insurgents were advancing down the slopes under covering fire, trying to overrun the American positions before the airstrikes could eliminate all their heavy weapons. Bravo 6. This is Hawkeye 2-1, Sarah called over the radio. I see enemy forces massing for a final assault on your positions. Can you mark your forward positions with smoke? Roger that, Hawkeye, Morrison replied. Popping red smoke on our northernmost position now. Be advised, the enemy is less than 50 meters from our lines on the eastern approach. Sarah could see the red smoke beginning to drift across the rocks, marking the forward edge of the SEAL defensive line. The Taliban fighters were indeed dangerously close enough that any airstrike would have to be delivered with surgical precision to avoid hitting friendly forces. It was exactly the kind of mission that required a pilot to fly low and slow, putting themselves at maximum risk to ensure accuracy. Despite her aircraft's condition, Sarah rolled into another attack run. This time, she was flying barely 500 feet above the ground, so low that she could see the expressions on the faces of Taliban fighters as they looked up at her damaged aircraft. Some of them raised their weapons and fired directly at her, their bullets striking the armored cockpit with metallic pings. Sarah's cannon fire walked across the advancing Taliban line like the hand of an angry god, each burst sending bodies flying and breaking up the coordinated assault. Enemy fighters who had been advancing with determination moments before now sought whatever cover they could find as 30mm rounds shattered rocks around them. The tide of battle was turning, but Sarah's aircraft was running out of time. Her remaining engine was overheating badly, and she could feel vibrations through the airframe that suggested critical structural damage. Every minute she stayed in the fight brought her closer to the point where her A-10 would no longer be capable of controlled flight. Sarah's fuel gauge showed she had less than 10 minutes of flying time remaining, and her battered A-10 was losing altitude steadily despite her best efforts to maintain level flight. The single remaining engine was running at maximum power just to keep the aircraft airborne, and she could smell the acrid scent of overheating metal even through her oxygen mask. Below in the valley, the situation remained desperate despite her intervention. The Taliban had regrouped after their failed assault and were now using a different strategy. They were systematically destroying the rocks and boulders that provided cover for the SEALs, using rocket-propelled grenades and recoilless rifles to collapse the defensive positions one by one. Hawkeye 2-1. This is Bravo 6. Morrison's voice came through the static, noticeably strained. They're taking apart our cover piece by piece. We've got multiple wounded who can't move, and our ammunition is down to the last few magazines. If you can't suppress those heavy weapons, we're not going to make it. Sarah could see the truth of Morrison's assessment through her targeting pod. The Taliban had learned to use the terrain to their advantage, positioning their heavy weapons in deep caves and crevices that provided protection from air attack, while still allowing them to pour fire down on the trapped SEALs. Traditional attack runs from above would be ineffective against these positions. That's when Sarah realized what she had to do, something that violated every rule in the book and pushed the capabilities of her aircraft beyond any reasonable limit. She would have to fly through the valley at ground level, using the terrain to mask her approach while engaging the hidden positions from the side where they were vulnerable. Stevens. This is Sarah, she called to her wingman. I'm going to make a low-level run through the valley from west to east. I need you to suppress any anti-aircraft positions on the northern ridge while I'm in the weeds. Sarah, that's suicide, Stevens replied immediately. Your aircraft won't survive flying through that valley. The crossfire alone will tear you apart, and if you lose your remaining engine in there, you won't have anywhere to eject safely. Sarah was already pushing her nose down toward the valley floor, flying so low that her landing gear almost scraped the rocky outcroppings. At this altitude, she was below the effective range of most surface-to-air missiles, but she was also within easy range of every rifle and machine gun in the area. The sound of bullets striking her aircraft became almost continuous. I know the risks, Sarah replied as she lined up for her final attack run, but 124 good men are going to die if I don't try this. Sometimes you have to risk everything to do what's right. As Sarah entered the valley at an altitude of less than 100 feet, the world around her exploded into chaos. Taliban fighters emerged from every concealment to pour fire at her aircraft, creating a tunnel of bullets and explosions that she had to fly through to reach the hidden weapons positions. Her cockpit filled with the sound of metal striking metal as her aircraft absorbed an incredible amount of damage. Sarah's cannon fire raked across the cave, mouths and crevices where the Taliban had positioned their heavy weapons, the 30mm rounds penetrating deep into the rock formations and silencing the guns that had been systematically destroying the SEAL positions. Explosions erupted along the ridgeline as ammunition stored in the caves detonated under the impact of her depleted uranium rounds. But the cost was enormous. Sarah felt her aircraft shudder as something vital failed in the engine compartment, and her remaining turbofan began to wind down with a dying whine. The control stick went completely dead in her hands as the final hydraulic system failed, leaving her with only manual reversion controls that barely responded to her inputs. Aircraft down, Stevens's voice cut through the radio static. Sarah's aircraft is going down in the valley. Sarah fought to keep her A-10 airborne long enough to clear the eastern ridge, but the laws of physics were no longer on her side. With no engine power and minimal control authority, her aircraft was essentially a 30,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. The question was no longer whether she would crash, but where. As her altimeter unwound through 500 feet, Sarah made her final decision as a pilot. Instead of ejecting and saving herself, she used her remaining control to aim her dying aircraft at the largest concentration of Taliban fighters she could see, a group that had been setting up to overrun the SEAL command post. If her A-10 was going down, it would take as many enemy fighters with it as possible. At the last possible second, Sarah pulled her ejection handle. The explosive charges beneath her seat fired with tremendous force, launching her clear of the doomed aircraft just as it slammed into the rocky mountainside in a tremendous fireball that consumed the Taliban position she had been aiming for. The explosion echoed through the valley like thunder, sending a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris high into the air. Sarah's parachute deployed automatically, but she was so low that she had only seconds to prepare for landing. She hit the rocky ground hard, feeling something snap in her left ankle as she rolled to absorb the impact. Pain shot up her leg, but she was alive and relatively intact despite having just ejected from a crashing aircraft at barely 300 feet altitude. As she struggled to release her parachute harness, Sarah could hear the sound of gunfire changing around the valley. The massive explosion of her aircraft had broken the Taliban's coordinated defense, and many of the fighters were retreating from their positions. The psychological impact of watching an American pilot deliberately crash her aircraft into their comrades had shaken the insurgents' resolve. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Bravo 6. Morrison's voice crackled through her survival radio. We see your chute. Are you injured? We're sending a team to your position. Sarah keyed her radio with trembling hands. Bravo 6, this is Hawkeye 2-1. I'm mobile but injured. Don't risk your people for me. Maintain your defensive positions. But it was too late for such concerns. The tide of battle had turned decisively in favor of the Americans. Sarah's sacrifice had eliminated the Taliban's heavy weapons positions and broken their will to continue the fight. Enemy fighters were streaming away from the valley, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. Within minutes, Sarah found herself surrounded by 4 SEALs who had fought their way across the valley to reach her position. Chief Petty Officer Williams, the senior enlisted man she had been supporting with her airstrikes, was among them. His face was blackened with smoke and his uniform was torn in several places, but his eyes were bright with determination. Ma'am, I'm Chief Williams, he said as he knelt beside her to examine her injured ankle. You saved our lives out there, all of us. That was the most courageous thing I've ever witnessed in 20 years of combat. Sarah winced as the medic among the SEALs began treating her ankle. I just did my job, Chief. You guys would have done the same thing for me. Williams shook his head as he helped her to her feet. No, ma'am, that wasn't just doing your job. You broke every rule in the book to save us. You knew they'd court-martial you for disobeying orders, but you came down anyway. As the SEALs helped Sarah limp toward their defensive positions, she could see the full scope of what her actions had accomplished. The valley floor was littered with abandoned Taliban weapons and equipment. Several enemy positions were still burning from her cannon fire, and the massive crater where her A-10 had impacted was visible from across the entire area. Most importantly, she could see American personnel moving freely around the valley, treating wounded and preparing for evacuation. The rescue helicopters arrived within the hour, now able to land safely in a valley that Sarah's sacrifice had cleared of anti-aircraft threats. As she was loaded onto a medical helicopter alongside the wounded SEALs, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. She had almost certainly ended her flying career by disobeying direct orders, but 124 American warriors were going home to their families because of that decision. Lieutenant Commander Morrison climbed into the helicopter beside her as it prepared to take off. His left arm was in a sling and his face bore several small cuts from flying debris, but he was alive and whole thanks to her intervention. Captain Mitchell, he said quietly, I want you to know that every man in Bravo 6 is putting you in for the I Medal of Honor. What you did today goes beyond valor. It was pure heroism. As the helicopter lifted off from the valley and headed toward the forward operating base, Sarah looked down at the battlefield one last time. The smoking remains of her A-10 were barely visible among the rocks, but the impact of her actions would be felt far beyond this remote valley in Afghanistan. She had proven that sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking the rules, and that true heroism means being willing to sacrifice everything for the lives of others. The investigation and court-martial proceedings would come later. But Sarah Mitchell had already secured her place in military history as the pilot who defied all orders to save 124 SEALs from certain death in a remote Afghan valley.